Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, June 5th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will be 91.2 degrees, with a low of 60.9 degrees, so please remember to stay cool and hydrated if you are spending time outdoors. On today's program, we are taking a closer look at how John Bolton's private notes factored into a federal plea agreement. We will also investigate why a flesh-eating parasite has re-emerged in the United States for the first time in 60 years. Beyond those top stories, we have a wide array of other developments to discuss as we check in on the latest updates from across the country. We have a full show ahead, so stay with us for all of this and more on Alex's News. Good morning, everyone. We're starting today with a major story out of Washington that closes one of the most contentious legal chapters of the Trump era. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton has reached a plea agreement with the Department of Justice to resolve a sweeping 18-count criminal case. For more on what this deal means and how we got here, we're joined by our political correspondent, Ethan. Ethan, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. It's a remarkable turn in a case that's been simmering for months. According to PBS NewsHour, BBC, and CNBC, Bolton has agreed to plead guilty to a single felony count of retaining classified information. That's a dramatic narrowing from the original 18 counts. And crucially, the deal could allow him to avoid prison time altogether.
So just one felony out of 18. What exactly does that single charge involve?
It's a count of unauthorized retention of national defense information. The agreement was finalized yesterday, June 4th, just one day before today's broadcast. PBS NewsHour and the BBC report that Bolton has to pay a $2.25 million fine. The charge carries a statutory maximum of 60 months, or 5 years, in prison. But the plea caps any sentence there and recommends no jail time. Of course, the final call rests with a federal judge.
And when will that judge weigh in?
A rearrangement hearing is scheduled for June 26, 2026. That's about 3 weeks from today, in the federal court in Greenbelt, Maryland. That's where the formal plea will be entered. Until then, there's still some uncertainty about whether Bolton walks away without serving time. But the recommendation is clearly tilted in that direction.
Ethan, walk us through the evidence at the heart of this. What did prosecutors actually have?
This is where it gets fascinating, Grace. CNBC and PBS NewsHour report that the core evidence involves what the government called diary-like notes that Bolton kept during his tenure as National Security Advisor from 2018 to 2019. We're talking over 1,000 pages of material, some of it classified up to the top secret/SCI level. That's sensitive compartmented information, the highest tier.
Over 1,000 pages. How did those notes leave secure channels?
According to the indictment, Bolton shared the materials with his wife and daughter through unencrypted personal messaging apps and email. He was preparing his 2020 memoir, The Room Where It Happened, and there's one exchange that's drawn a lot of attention. Bolton wrote to his relatives, quote, "None of which we talk about," end quote, with 3 exclamation points. A relative replied, quote, "Shh," end quote. Prosecutors point to that as evidence he knew the material was sensitive.
That's striking. What kind of secrets were in those notes?
Reportedly, some of the most guarded material in the U.S. intelligence community. The materials included details on foreign adversaries, missile launches, covert action plans, and even specific intelligence sources and methods. That last category is what makes officials especially nervous, because exposing sources and methods can put lives at risk and compromise ongoing operations.
So how did investigators even find out about these diary notes?
This is one of the most unusual investigative origins I've come across. The Washington Post and CBS News point to a 2021 cyber attack during the Biden administration. Bolton's personal AOL account was breached by what the DOJ describes as an Iranian actor. Bolton's representatives reported the hack to the FBI at the time, but the government alleges they didn't disclose that the account contained classified national defense information.
An Iranian hack on a former National Security Advisor's AOL account. That alone is a story.
It really is, and the investigation continued quietly for years. It was, in the DOJ's words, well underway, but it escalated sharply after Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025. By August of last year, FBI agents executed search warrants at Bolton's Maryland home and his Washington office. The Guardian reports that finding those diary notes during the hacking probe gave prosecutors the probable cause they had lacked back in 2020.
2020? What happened then?
That's when the first Trump administration tried to block publication of Bolton's book through a civil lawsuit. They wanted to confiscate his roughly $2 million advance and argued he hadn't completed the pre-publication review. That effort failed in court. So in a sense, this criminal case picked up where that civil case left off, this time with hard evidence in hand.
That brings us to the political backdrop, doesn't it? There's been a lot of talk about who the DOJ has been pursuing.
Absolutely. ABC News and NPR have noted that Bolton's indictment back in October 2025 came just weeks after the indictments of other prominent Trump critics. That includes former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Critics have called it a pattern of retribution. Defenders of the DOJ argue each case stands on its own facts.
And how did those other cases play out?
Differently, Grace. In November 2025, a federal judge dismissed the cases against Comey and James because the prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, had been, quote, unlawfully appointed, end quote. Legal analysts told the BBC and CNBC that Bolton's case stood on firmer ground because it was handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland under lawfully appointed leadership. That made it much harder to challenge on procedural grounds.
So Comey's situation is fully resolved?
Not entirely. Comey still faces a separate active case in North Carolina over an Instagram post that was interpreted as a threat to the president. That's the so-called 8647 seashell post. So his legal exposure isn't over. But for Bolton, the calculation was different, and he chose to settle rather than fight.
Why settle if his team has been calling this a political vendetta all along?
A person familiar with the matter told the BBC that Bolton, quote, takes responsibility, end quote, and wanted to avoid a trial that might risk further damage to national security. A trial would likely require introducing classified evidence in open court, even with protective measures. That's a risk neither side wanted. So a plea spares everyone that exposure.
Let's circle back to that fine. $2.25 million. That sounds enormous for a single count.
It is enormous, Grace, and that's exactly what's caught legal experts' attention. CNN and the Washington Post note that the typical maximum for a single count of retention is around $250,000. So this figure is nearly 10 times that. Experts suggest it's functioning as a de facto seizure of the profits from Bolton's memoir.
So this is essentially a clawback of the book money?
That appears to be the design. Remember, in 2020, the Trump administration unsuccessfully sued to confiscate Bolton's roughly $2 million advance. By setting the fine at $2.25 million, the DOJ has effectively negotiated a clawback of those book proceeds, but under the guise of a criminal penalty. It bypasses the failures of that earlier civil litigation. It's a creative use of a fine, and it'll likely be studied for years.
How is Bolton's defense team framing all of this?
His legal team is led by Abe Lowell, a very prominent defense attorney. They've consistently called the charges a political vendetta meant to silence a critic. They've compared the case to other high-profile mishandling incidents, like those involving Sandy Berger and David Petraeus. Both of those men were allowed to plead to misdemeanors, despite what the defense calls more overt acts of concealment or obstruction. So Bolton's team feels he's being treated more harshly.
And what's the DOJ saying right now?
As of today, June 5th, the DOJ has declined to comment on the specifics of the negotiations. They're letting the paperwork speak for itself. The public really won't get full clarity until that June 26th hearing in Greenbelt. That's when we'll see the formal entry of the plea and possibly hear more from the judge about sentencing direction.
Bottom line, Ethan, will one of the most prominent hawks in American foreign policy end up behind bars?
That's the question everyone's asking, Grace. Based on the terms of the deal, with a recommendation of no jail time, it seems unlikely. But the judge isn't bound by that recommendation. So Bolton may simply pay a very steep price for what his team has called meticulous note-taking and what prosecutors call a serious breach of national security. Either way, this closes a chapter that's been hanging over Washington for nearly a year.
Fascinating reporting, Ethan. Thanks so much for breaking it all down for us this morning.
My pleasure, Grace.
Now to a story that's putting America's cattle industry on edge this morning. A flesh-eating parasite gone from U.S. soil for 60 years is back. Our reporter Chloe has been following every development. Chloe, good morning, and just how serious is this?
Good morning, Grace. It's very serious, and frankly, it's something most Americans have never had to think about. The U.S. Department of Agriculture confirmed 2 days ago, on June 3rd, that the New World screwworm was found in a 3-week-old beef calf in Zavala County, Texas. According to the Texas Tribune, the larvae were discovered in the calf's umbilical area near the town of La Pryor. This is the first time the parasite has turned up in U.S. cattle since it was officially eradicated back in 1966.
60 years is a long time. What exactly makes this insect so feared by ranchers?
It's the biology that sets it apart, Grace. Unlike common blowflies, the screwworm feeds exclusively on the living flesh of warm-blooded animals, including livestock, pets, and even humans. The Texas Tribune reports that a single female fly can lay up to 300 eggs in a wound as small as a tick bite. Over her 10 to 30-day lifespan, she may lay up to 3,000 eggs total. Once those eggs hatch, the maggots use specialized hooks to burrow deep into the host's skin.
That sounds horrifying. And what happens if several flies hit the same animal?
That's where it gets truly grim. When multiple flies target the same wound, it creates what scientists call a feeding frenzy, causing rapid, massive tissue damage. If left untreated, the infestation is typically fatal to the animal. The Guardian and ABC News both note that human infections are rare, but the CDC warns that travelers or anyone with open wounds in endemic areas can be at risk. Symptoms include painful, foul-smelling sores and the unsettling sensation of movement within the skin.
I imagine people will be tempted to try to treat that themselves. Is that safe?
Absolutely not, Grace. The CDC is strongly advising against any kind of self-removal of maggots because surgical intervention may actually be required. For people, the prevention guidance is straightforward. Keep wounds covered, use insect repellent, and make sure windows are screened when sleeping. For livestock and pet owners, daily inspection is the key. If anyone spots draining wounds or visible maggots, they should contact a veterinarian or a state animal health official immediately.
Let's talk about the response on the ground. What are officials doing right now to contain it?
Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins and Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller have mobilized emergency protocols. Scientific American reports that a 20-kilometer quarantine perimeter, that's about 12.4 miles, has been set up around the infection site. There are strict movement controls on all warm-blooded animals inside that zone. An incident command team that includes the Texas Animal Health Commission is currently trapping flies, screening local wildlife, and doing outreach in Zavala and Uvalde County communities.
And as of today, June 5th, has the parasite turned up anywhere else?
Not yet, and that's the good news. CBS News and Scientific American report that no additional cases have been confirmed outside the 20-kilometer Zavala County quarantine zone. But neighboring states aren't taking chances. Oklahoma and New Mexico have already issued advisories for producers moving animals out of South Texas. Officials know that even one missed case could undo decades of work.
Speaking of decades of work, how did this parasite even reach Texas after 60 years?
It's been a slow-motion crisis, really. The current outbreak is the culmination of a 3-year northward march from South America. Historically, the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama served as a natural biological barrier, but that barrier was breached back in 2023. The USDA officially blames illegal cattle imports and surveillance gaps left over from the COVID-19 pandemic, but independent reporting suggests the story is more complicated than that.
More complicated how? What are other outlets finding?
The Guardian and Reuters report that larvae were observed at the Copeg sterile fly production plant in Panama in 2025, which has fueled theories of a systemic failure. On top of that, a July 2025 report from the joint FAO/IAEA suggested the Copeg facility, which is the world's primary source of sterile flies, suffered what they called a production collapse. It simply couldn't scale up fast enough to meet the surge that began in 2023. So the biological wall that held for 6 decades essentially had a hole punched in it.
Let's bring this home for our viewers. What does this mean for the price of beef and the broader economy?
The numbers are staggering, Grace. Texas leads the nation in cattle production, an industry worth $15 billion annually to the state. The Texas Tribune reports that a full-scale outbreak could cause $1.8 billion in damage to the Texas economy alone. Nationally, the USDA estimated back in 2005 that the parasite caused roughly $6.1 billion in annual losses, adjusted for today's dollars across South America and the Caribbean.
And what about the meat already on shelves? Should shoppers be worried?
That's an important distinction. The Guardian notes that the flies pose no direct threat to food safety, meaning the meat itself is not infected, but the secondary effects are already being felt at the grocery store. Beef prices are currently at record highs, and a prolonged pandemic among cattle could destabilize the nationwide supply chain even further. So consumers may not see contaminated beef, but they could very well see higher prices.
I understand there's also a political fight brewing over how to handle this. What's the disagreement?
There's real friction between state and federal officials. Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller has criticized the USDA's response, telling the Texas Tribune that it's been, quote, slow, bureaucratic, and incomplete, end quote. The main point of contention involves something called the Screwworm Adult Suppression System, or SWAS. Miller has urged the Trump administration to deploy it because it uses chemical baits to kill adult flies, but the USDA has rejected that approach.
Why is the USDA pushing back on SWAS?
It comes down to the chemistry. Undersecretary Scott Hutchins has labeled the chemical components a, quote, probable carcinogen, end quote. Per EPA classifications, the active ingredient in SWAS, called dichlorvos, is a group B2 carcinogen. The USDA maintains the system is simply too toxic for wide-scale environmental release. So instead, they're doubling down on a different approach called the sterile insect technique.
Walk us through how that sterile insect technique actually works.
It's really clever, Grace. Scientists release millions of laboratory-raised, sterile male flies into the wild. Those males mate with wild females, but the eggs they produce are unviable, so the population collapses over time. That's the strategy that helped eradicate the screwworm in the first place back in the 1960s. The problem now is that production capacity has become a serious bottleneck.
What's slowing that production down?
A few things are colliding at once. The U.S. currently depends on the aging Copeg plant in Panama, which we mentioned earlier has its own troubles. A new $750 million sterile fly production facility broke ground at Moore Air Base in Edinburgh, Texas, just 2 months ago in April 2026. But it's not slated for completion until November 2027, which is more than a year away. So there's a real timing gap between when this outbreak hit and when domestic capacity will be online.
I've also heard concerns about staffing cuts at USDA. How does that fit in?
That's another flashpoint. Critics point out that recent government-wide efficiency mandates, linked to what's been called DOGE, led to a 27% reduction in the USDA workforce. That included the loss of nearly 250 employees in Texas who were vital for border surveillance and what's known as tick riding, basically patrolling on horseback. Those are exactly the people you'd want on the front lines of an outbreak like this. So the response capacity has been thinned at a very inconvenient moment.
So what's the immediate game plan from here?
For now, the USDA is focused on what it calls a 5-pronged strategy. It involves sterile fly dispersal from a temporary facility in Tampico, Mexico, and the deployment of tick riders to patrol the border. The goal is to reestablish the biological wall that held for 6 decades. Whether that wall can be rebuilt fast enough is really the question every rancher in Texas is asking this morning.
Chloe, this is a story we'll clearly be following for a long time. Thanks so much for breaking it down for us.
Happy to do it, Grace. We'll keep watching for any new detections beyond that quarantine zone.
Here are some other headlines. Starting in Eastern Europe, President Zelensky is hoping to put pen to paper to find some common ground. He has issued an unprecedented open letter to Vladimir Putin, calling for the two leaders to finally meet face-to-face in a neutral third country to end a war that has now entered its 5th year. Zelensky is looking to break the diplomatic stalemate by suggesting venues like Switzerland, Turkey, or the Gulf Arab states, though he has explicitly ruled out Moscow or Kyiv as possible landing spots. With American attention currently drifting toward a conflict with Iran, Kyiv is looking to take the wheel rather than waiting for American mediation to get back on track. This move marks a significant shift in strategy, as Ukraine tries to leverage recent battlefield gains from long-range strike capabilities to negotiate on equal terms. While President Trump has given the call for a summit his stamp of approval, stating both sides need to compromise, the Kremlin is responding with a cold shoulder. Spokesperson Dmitry Peskov invited Zelensky to Moscow instead, while President Putin dismissed European nations as potential mediators, claiming they have too much skin in the game due to their military support. Back on the home front, the Senate pulled an all-nighter to ensure that immigration enforcement doesn't run out of gas. In a 52-47 vote early Friday morning, a $70 billion bill was passed to secure funding for federal agencies through the end of President Trump's term in 2029. Senate Majority Leader John Thune utilized the budget reconciliation process to bypass a Democratic filibuster, successfully ending a months-long impasse that had partially shuttered the Department of Homeland Security. The legislation allocates approximately $38.2 billion to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and $26 billion to Customs and Border Protection. The bill notably rejected amendments to block a controversial $1.8 billion Justice Department settlement fund. Senator Lisa Murkowski was the sole Republican to vote against the measure following an 18-hour vote-a-rama. The Supreme Court also handed down a high-stakes decision that has federal agencies feeling fine. In an 8-1 ruling, the court upheld the Federal Communications Commission's authority to penalize telecommunications companies without a jury trial. Chief Justice John Roberts clarified that the agency's in-house process does not violate the 7th Amendment because its orders are not self-executing. This means telecom giants like AT&T and Verizon are still on the hook for nearly $200 million in penalties for the unauthorized sale of customer location data. Justice Clarence Thomas was the lone dissenter, arguing that the government should have to go to court before taking property. In the Grand Canyon state, the prosecution of the fake elector case has hit a major speed bump. The Arizona Supreme Court rejected an appeal to revive the case, effectively requiring the Attorney General's office to restart from scratch before a new grand jury. The ruling found that original grand jurors weren't shown the full text of a 19th-century Electoral Count Act, which defense attorneys claim allowed for alternative slates of electors. While 18 defendants, including Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani, have caught a temporary break, Attorney General Chris Mays says she will not drop the charges. Finally, the National Science Foundation is making waves by dismantling a $386 million ocean sensor network. Following an 80% reduction in federal funding, the foundation is descoping the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which has provided a critical climate record for a decade. Scientists warn that losing this data is a real wash, especially as a predicted El Niño event looms on the horizon. From the coast of Oregon to the Irminger Sea near Greenland, more than 900 instruments are being recovered, leaving researchers high and dry just when they need to monitor marine heat waves the most. The phased decommissioning is expected to continue through 2027. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.